So what do climate change and capitalism, two big topics, have to do with each other? I want to argue that climate change will end capitalism as we know it within the next few decades and stress the need for us to consider alternative political and social arrangements sooner rather than later. Now, scholars tend to define capitalism by referring to private ownership of the means of production or the primacy of individual profit. But the aspect that I want to focus on is its demand for infinite economic growth. For while capitalism has been around for a long time now, it has accelerated since approximately 1950. And this becomes obvious no matter what indicators we look at, whether it's population, economic activity, motor vehicles, or paper consumption. The impact on the biosphere is similarly glaring, whether we measure that in water usage, rainforest loss, ozone depletion, or carbon dioxide concentration. To understand this acceleration, though, requires us to go into some detail about the most important aspect of modern capitalism, its need for growth. The story of our recent obsession with growth begins during World War II. By fully mobilizing the most developed industrial society in the world, by outproducing our foes, and thereby pulling ourselves out of the Great Depression, the United States seemed to have discovered the secret to economic progress. In the post-war period, then, growth was raised from merely one among many economic goals to an organizing political principle. For a good 3 decades, conditions seemed to bend their will to this new principle. The baby boom constituted the largest population increase in American history, and American productivity and personal consumption both increased by over 20%. In the immediate post-war years, the US, with only 7% of global population, accounted for nearly half of global manufacturing output and accrued nearly half of the world's income each year. During this golden era, notions of progress, which were linked to American exceptionalism and manifest destiny, were translated into the theory of economic growth. Consumption was no longer something that should be stifled or feared as it was during the Depression, but a new civic obligation. The pursuit and expectation of economic growth became one of the key features of Kennedy's New Frontier. The signs were everywhere, sometimes quite literally. Soon after his inauguration, placards asking, "What have you done for growth today?" appeared on every desk in the Department of Commerce. So while growth seemed, in this formulation at least, to be an end in itself, it actually served 2 key political purposes. So in the first, economic growth became a key site of competition in the Cold War. As the Soviet Union and the US sought to attract non-aligned states around the world, their ability to produce cheap goods and thereby deliver material comfort and a high quality of life became a key issue. In this aspect, at least, the US and the Soviet Union both committed to continuing economic growth as a guarantor of the good life, had much in common. Second, economic growth would play a vital role in allowing American politicians to sidestep questions about the distribution of wealth. This question of how to slice the pie of national wealth could remain unanswered so long as that pie continued to grow. And this is a core principle of American capitalism even today. Although growth mania, as some historians refer to it, was seriously challenged in the early 1970s, it remains an essential pillar of our secular ideology. In the 90s, behind the neoliberal stewardship of the Clinton administration and the financialization of the US economy, the expectation of continued economic growth assumed a slightly different form, a collective investment in the stock market. So what's wrong with all of this? Well, for one, the idea of economic growth as a chief measure of success became exported around the world through organizations such as the World Bank and the IMF that tied loans to increases in GDP. So the GDP became regularly referred to by economists, politicians, and even the media as if it represented overall progress or even happiness. But increased GDP doesn't necessarily make people any happier. A focus on growth can be misleading because GDP measures all sorts of things that we might wish we had less of, such as prisons and private police forces. During the Cold War, GDP per capita roughly tripled, so that by 1991, the average American family had twice as many cars as they did in 1950. They drove twice as far, they used 20 times as much plastic, and they flew 25 times as far, but they were barely any happier. And when looking at life satisfaction from a comparative perspective, we find that it tends to increase rapidly up to about $10,000 GDP per capita, and then levels off. And you see the same curve within individual countries. So the lesson is that more is not necessarily better. And of course, GDP only measures total productivity, and not the extent to which any gains are distributed equally among citizens. Even though our GDP has quadrupled since 1980, the average American has barely seen any of that gain. Most importantly, GDP is strongly correlated with destruction of the natural environment. We need to recognize that environmental destruction isn't an unfortunate byproduct of capitalism, but an inevitable result of a system which really maximizes economic activity at all costs. So I want to take a step back from this history and ask what kinds of images or landscapes you would associate with capitalism. So for example, you might think of the factories of the Industrial Revolution, or perhaps the exploitation of workers, including children, which those of us in the West can pretend is no longer occurring. Probably think of Wall Street today. But what other kinds of landscapes should we be thinking of? Perhaps the haunting landscapes of clear-cut forests around the world, 36 football fields of forest cut down every single minute. Or the ruined remains of mining ever deeper into the earth for resources. Or perhaps our vast mountains of waste, shipped to locations that most of us can hope to never have to look at. But I want to focus on the shared landscapes of climate change and capitalism. From Katrina, Sandy, and dozens of other storms, we've seen how devastating floods can be. But they don't affect everyone equally. Instead, they tend to highlight existing inequalities and destroy poor communities that lack the resources to protect themselves and rebuild, especially in the global south. Now, we tend to think of climate change as a future threat, but it already adversely affects 300 million people around the world. However, most of them live in countries that have contributed very few historical carbon emissions. By 2100, sea level is expected to rise by as much as 5 feet. And under current trends, 1/3 of the planet's landmass will be desert by 2100. Up to half will suffer regular drought. So scholars estimate that climate change is already responsible for about 300,000 deaths every year. But how do they calculate a number like this? Well, in many places, the yearly averages of something like rainfall are barely changed, but new unpredictable weather patterns make life almost impossible. For example, in Kenya, there's now either extreme drought or heavy rains, which then cause fatal floods. In the global south, where many people are far more dependent on local agriculture, violence over water and other resources is a regular occurrence. Of course, this violence is rarely reported as having anything to do with climate change, let alone the energy demands of the West. Now, most mainstream discussions about climate change, including forums like this, tend to hype this or that alternative energy source or tout a Manhattan Project scale campaign to solve climate change. I'm certainly not discounting the need for continued development of alternative technology sources on that scale, but we should also confront the future with eyes open. In 2050, there will be 9 billion people on the planet. And for them to live as we do in the United States today, our energy efficiency would have to be 130 times what it is right now. But what mainstream speakers don't mention, and what drives so many mild-mannered environmentalists or environment-minded professors to sound like revolutionaries, is that climate change is only one of the major stresses on the biosphere. So I want to very briefly mention two others. The first is resource depletion. Our appetite and numbers are drawing down the resources that we now depend on, just as much as we depend on oxygen and water. The question is not whether we will run out of resources like petroleum, but whether they will or have already become too costly. In 1930, for every unit of energy you put into oil exploration in the United States, you got 100 times that out. Now the average is only 11 to 1, and it's much lower for things like tar sands and fracking. Even if we stop burning fossil fuels today, we'd still face a landscape of diminishing resources, including water scarcity, topsoil erosion, deforestation, and depletion of key minerals. And then there's biodiversity loss. 1/4 of all animal species are expected to become extinct over the next 50 years. Now, it's hard to picture what something like this actually means, this kind of scale. For example, I want to show 3 species that have gone extinct or are thought to have gone extinct in the last decade. The first is the Madeiran large white butterfly. This is the puli, or honey creeper, in Hawaii. This is the Pyrenean ibex. So if I were to show you an image of an animal that's expected to go extinct by 2050, and I held that image on screen for only 1 second each, we would still be here for over 10 days. So what are our lives going to look like in 30, 40, or 100 years as a result of our devotion to economic growth today? Well, we're going to see landscapes of drought shorn of their natural beauty, flooded cities, and ultimately new ways of living or coping. Solutions to contemporary environmental crises certainly involve lots of gains in energy efficiency and new technologies. But it would be far-fetched to think that these kind of events won't change the way that we think and live. There's no question that climate change will actually change us. But will it be for the better or for the worse? I want to lay out two options for the future. The first, and one that admittedly the United States is headed towards right now, might be called Fortress America. The next few decades will see hundreds of millions of climate refugees, and our current stance on immigration, which has very little to do with empathy or justice, is certainly not promising. It's easy to see politicians, so many of whom are funded by fossil fuel concerns, digging in their heels and ignoring a real transformation before it's too late, and relying on America's military power to ensure that business as usual lasts just as long as possible. But walling ourselves off from the rest of the world simply won't work because environmental problems don't respect national borders. As I've shown, climate change is only one of many crises. So unless you believe the theory that finite natural resources, including carbon sinks, can somehow support infinite economic growth, growth-based systems such as capitalism are simply not sustainable. Liberals like Al Gore and Thomas Friedman propose alternative technologies, revitalized markets, and minor individual lifestyle changes because they want to hold on to capitalism, to business as usual. They contort themselves to figure out how the task of addressing the destructiveness of capitalism can itself be made possible, but perhaps it can't. Perhaps, as Murray Bookchin has argued, capitalism can no more be persuaded to limit growth than an individual human being can be persuaded to stop breathing. What we're seeing now and what we'll see over the next few decades is not an accident, but really the logical result of a world capitalist system that motivates people to accumulate unlimited wealth, power, and resources. In this way, I think green capitalism is really an oxymoron. So this is to say that over the next 40 years, we have a choice. Let our growth mania drive the planet to ecological collapse, or get rid of capitalism. This is not so much an appeal for a transformation as it is a prediction that change is coming, and that the sooner we develop alternatives, the sooner we make the necessary transition, the less violence we, our children, and our grandchildren will experience. So while it certainly seems as if a transformation away from capitalism is not on the horizon, we should keep in mind that radical systemic change is as common as grass in world history. The average American living in 1770, the average Frenchman in 1780, and the average Russian in 1915 might have been just as dubious about these words applied to their own society. Sure, change happens, they might say, but not here and not now. However, psychologists have reported what they call an end of history illusion, in which individuals regularly underestimate how much they'll change in the future. Almost everyone recognizes how much we've changed in the last decade or two, but when asked to predict how much will change in the next 2 decades, it's regularly underestimated. Come back 10 years later, of course, and they're dead wrong. And I think this is true of politics as well. The late Margaret Thatcher, used the phrase, "There is no alternative," to justify her policies of austerity so often that it eventually earned its own nickname. There is no alternative. Tina. We're told that there is only one way to live, and it is ours, and it just happens to be the best ever. I disagree with Thatcher here, and I think you should too. Capitalism has worked out quite well for many Americans, who for over 50 years now have enjoyed the highest standard of living in human history. While few people in the world would ever want to give up the conveniences that capitalism has delivered, largely by exploiting an ancient bank of energy in the form of fossil fuels, it has also brought us to the brink of ecological collapse. The proposition that human society is maximized by a group of individuals pursuing their own self-interest, and that government should simply step aside and let markets work their magic, this proposition is failing. And I think if that's not clear now, it will be in 10 or 20 years. But what's the alternative then? Well, the task we're facing is not so much environmental as it is political, to decarbonize rapidly, obviously, but also to develop alternative arrangements beyond self-interest. That's why I think radically democratic protest movements such as Occupy Wall Street and the international climate justice movement are so important. And I think they should be judged not just for the small ways that they influence our policy today, but for the alternative forms of greater democracy, awareness, and accountability that they introduce into our consciousness. For example, the argument advanced by climate justice activists that everyone has the right to the same carbon emissions is a radically egalitarian proposition, but it's also one that's hard to deny. So exactly how do we get to this kind of utopian vision of the future? I don't have the precise answer, but I do know, as anthropologists can attest, that human beings have organized themselves in thousands of different ways in our history. And we should draw on these experiences as we construct our own future. We should expect, prepare, and advocate for a move away from market fundamentalism and militarism towards significantly lessened carbon footprints, greater attention to public goods and services, and their transformation from interest group politics to more direct forms of democracy. Not so much because they represent better ways to live, but because, as Thatcher might say, it's our only option. So I think we might take a lesson from Milton Friedman and recognize that our responsibility is not only to change the way we live and think in the here and now, but to develop alternatives, to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable. Ultimately, the belief that there is no alternative is what assures us, or perhaps condemns us, to more of the same. If we can provide a vision of a better future, the climate crisis might just give us an opportunity to create a healthier and more equitable world. Thank you.